So we cannot expect that just because the buzz of AI is out there right now is fixing every single thing.
People, asking ChatGPT, asking Claude legal questions and over relying on those answers given by those models.
In the US, they have realized how big of a problem having legal assistance is.
Hello, hello. Good time of day to everyone. Welcome to the Automation Followers podcast. Today we'll be going to talking about access to justice, automation, and everybody's favorite topic these days, AI. I'm your host, Martin Kravchenko, CTO at Automation Followers, and today I'm joined by Mauricio Duarte. Mauricio is a lawyer from Guatemala with an LL.M in US law and technology from the University of St. Thomas. He's worked for 7 years in legal technology, understanding how tech can interact with legal services. He's currently the chief operating officer for A2J Tech, a public benefit corporation based in Denver, Colorado, that aims to improve access to justice through technology, products, and services. Welcome to the show, Mauricio.
Thank you, Martin. Nice being with you today.
Fantastic, fantastic. So, to get things going, I would just love to know a bit more about your story. So, can you tell us a bit more about your journey from being a lawyer in Guatemala to moving to the US and becoming a justice entrepreneur?
Yeah, it's I would say a bit of a weird story, but I'll give it a shot. So, as you mentioned, I was trained and I studied to become an attorney back home in Guatemala. At that moment in time, I was very interested in the dispute resolution realm, arbitration and international dispute resolution. I was very as a student, I was very focused into that. But as I grew and I started to experience some of the things on the litigation side, I was always questioning myself if it was truly what it was going to create the most impact in a sense in the legal space. Again, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a doctor, so I cannot speak about impact in the scientific field. But I was always thinking to myself, is this the impact or the type of impact that I want to have on the legal industry? So at that moment in time, it was a question mark in my mind about keeping in that world. And then when I started my master's degree in US law and technology, I started to understand how technology was going to impact the legal industry, how it was going to impact legal services. And I would say after 7 years, most lawyers are just starting to notice how technology impacts them. But I think it's going to have even a bigger impact in a couple more years. But at that moment in time, with my master's program and also with that question mark, that's when I started to realize that my main interest was in technology, was how can we grab technology and legal problems, put them together. Again, some things require technology, some require changes of processes, some require changes of staffing. But I know that technology is a tool that could accelerate certain types of changes. Again, I will always say this: technology is not going to solve all your problems, but it can certainly be a beneficial tool if you know how to deploy it and where to use it. So that's where, when I decided to move from my background as a litigation attorney, or at least an up and coming litigation attorney, I then migrated to start my own practice. I advise technology startups and technology companies. And after a couple of years in that role, I then was interested on being on real, being pragmatic with technology. At that moment in time, I was also doing my own, let's call them garage technology projects, in which I was creating some integrations. I was creating some small apps, but it was only for my operational sake, in a sense, to be more efficient. And after that, right before COVID, I had a meeting with Joseph Schiefer, the CEO of A2J Tech. He was a member of Legal Hackers. I was also a member of Legal Hackers in a different chapter. And that's when I decided to join A2J Tech. And it has been almost 5 years now since I joined A2J Tech. So a bit of a short history, but that's how I came to this role that I truly enjoy and love.
I love it. I love it. I understand. Like, obviously, the your master's degree was kind of the pivotal moment where you decided that you really want to focus on technology. And after that, I love the fact about tinkering with automations and that garage automation projects. Why are you so interested in legal aid? Why did you decide to pursue that opportunity with A2J?
Yeah, so I would say the one thing that most individuals from a legal background, at least not in the US, but in other countries, don't understand is how big of an impact legal aid has in developed countries. So, for instance, Canada, the US, I would say are probably one of the few countries across Latin America or America in general as a continent that truly invest in legal aid. You might have some other countries in the region that do some pro bono efforts, but in the US, they have realized how big of a problem having legal assistance is. One, it's very expensive. Two, it could be complex or burdensome. And third, it does. There seems to be a gap that is increasing over time, and there's no way to solve it just by having more attorneys. Like the access to justice problem isn't going to be fixed with more lawyers. In a sense, it's going to be fixed by some infrastructure changes. And why I found legal aid so compelling was they have been helping people with legal needs, legal problems with subpar technology solutions, or at least some of them. Some of them don't have great technology. Some of them think because I have a limited budget, I cannot access good technology. So, what drove me to legal aid is we can come in, help them, give them very good or decent solutions to help their audience, but at a deeper level, I understood that if we did things the right way, we could have a much deeper impact in legal services in general. So that's why we have been working with legal aid. Again, we also work with courts, bar associations, law firms to some extent, but I would say our main focus has always been legal aid and now courts because they truly have a very big impact into those people seeking legal help. With lawyers, sometimes, or working with law firms, sometimes it's difficult to see the value of how you are impacting that legal service. With legal aid, it's a bit more measurable. So, yeah, law firms are still doing their own efforts to help the access to justice problem by creating pro bono opportunities or creating smaller apps in which they can productize certain legal services. So that's a bit of what drove me to work with legal aid.
Right, right, right. And as you mentioned, I understand, US, Canada, I guess also UK I invest in quite a lot in legal aid. I also then
Yeah.
help in countries across Latin America, across other regions
We
in that
have
sector.
we have yeah, we have helped, let's say, a couple organizations in Canada. We have worked with a few organizations that also have legal aid. We have advised some organizations in Latin America. In Europe, I would say not in the UK, but we have helped a few organizations in Australia, New Zealand, some in some other countries. Again, we believe that some of the good practices or maybe the tools that we have here, we can show them and we can show other people in other jurisdictions how they might be able to use it. That's a good thing about technology. Most of the time, technology can be used in different jurisdictions. There might be some limitations or exceptional outliers to multiple reasons. But yeah, I would say we have worked with organizations across the globe. Again, we don't want to say all countries, but we have worked with, again, as I said, people in Australia and New Zealand. I have we have advised as a consultant with a company in El Salvador that is trying to do an access to justice for equal rights. So we have been helping across the board, Martin.
Right. That's amazing. And I understand you also have a few education initiatives that you're promoting online. We'll talk about them a bit later in this conversation. Now, I would love to understand a bit more how some of the particularities, let's say, of the projects that
Mhm.
you are building in this space. Now, before we get into that, let's get the basis down. So, how do you define access to justice?
So, access to justice is the ability for any individual to access legal information, to exercise their legal rights, or to have access to an infrastructure that is going to help them solve their problems. Most of the time, people think that access to justice is only access to an attorney, which not necessarily it's the case. Sometimes many of the legal problems that you have could be solved by yourself. There's a concept in the US that in some countries that I have experience with that you cannot go into court by yourself. That means that you have to always be represented by an attorney. In the US, there's this concept of self represented litigants. That means that you can be your own representative. You don't need a lawyer. In certain types of disputes, not necessarily in everything, but in certain types of disputes, you can be your own representation. So that is helpful for those individuals that do not have the money to spend on a lawyer or don't want to use a lawyer. I know that many individuals are very sharp that they can, with legal information in front of them, they can say, okay, I know how I can argue in front of a judge of this X, Y, and Z. So the access to legal information is also important. And the third component that I mentioned is the infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, it's not only physical infrastructure, but let's say process infrastructure. That means being able to attend a court that is efficient and that has the necessary infrastructure to attend individuals with disabilities. So it's a very, very broad concept to some extent, but that's why it's a very difficult problem to solve because it's not, as I said, it's not only going to be solved by putting more attorneys. It's going to be solved by making some infrastructure changes, some process changes, even to some extent how you present information to the users of the legal system. So in that realm, access to justice, I always break it down. And I remember I posted one of my initial contributions at A2J Tech. For some reason, it has been used as a for a good friend of mine as a recommended read on Coursera. But it was I broke down in 7 different potential concepts that you can think of access to justice, and it was not only access to legal information or exercise your legal rights, but even I mentioned the access to education, to public education with a legal background, giving you some basic lessons of what are some of the rights that you might have. I know now in some high schools and some schools are giving you that civics lesson of what are some of the rights that you have as a citizen. So those type of things go into access to justice. But yeah, I'll probably stop there with that
Right, right.
scope of
No,
access to justice.
quite a big range ultimately of factors has come into play, and I understand that
Yeah,
even if you are represented by an attorney, ultimately access to justice can also mean that you yourself as a client of legal services are also better educated about them, right, and can make
yeah,
also a rational decision yourself of whether you like the approach or not, or able to actually keep up the conversation and really make sure that you have as high of chances of winning the dispute as
yeah.
possible, right? Let's really focus on your work at A2G Tech. Can you explain or like share an example of a particularly impactful project that you worked on?
Yeah, I can mention, let's say, two, and I would say this goes to the core of legal information and to some aspects, legal infrastructure. So, one of the things that we created, this was an initiative right after COVID. We started see the need of developing points of access to legal information for individuals living in rural areas. That means individuals that don't have access to high internet. Sometimes they don't even have access to a computer. Again, people, I cannot tell you that how many times people get shocked when I tell them not everyone in the U.S. has a phone or a computer. It's a developed country, yes, but there's still poverty. There's still individuals that don't have access to some, let's say, needs that you might have. Again, a computer is not necessarily a need. To some, they might be considered a luxury. So with that, what we created, this started with a joint initiative in Minnesota, where I'm living now, in which they had this notion of creating legal kiosks. So we said, okay, we can help you out developing this notion of legal kiosks, and we deployed over 230 different kiosks across different locations. That means community centers, courts, other, let's say, public locations in which individuals could go into a kiosk, access legal information. That meant that we built an interface that had different options, different tiles for them to navigate. Let's say if they needed information about a family law issue or they needed information about an eviction issue, they had the ability to access legal information. At the same time, they were able to apply for legal help because in Minnesota, there are multiple programs that provide legal aid. If you were in the specific location, the program that might be able to serve you might be different. And we also created the ability to join at that moment in time because it was right during COVID. It was the ability to join virtual hearings. So usually courts give you a Zoom link that you were able to join, and you can take, let's say, your hearing in that link. Now that project that started in Minnesota then started to get a lot of attention from other states and from other programs. So that meant that we helped other programs in other states to replicate the same approach. So, for instance, we have expanded to Georgia, to San Bernardino, to Florida, to Nevada. So we have expanded the notion of legal kiosk. And again, a legal kiosk is not necessarily something that we created. We just helped accelerate some of the things because we did the website interface on top of the logistics, on top of some other things from a technology perspective that accelerated the deployment of those kiosks. So I would say that's one of the more impactful projects. We have done a few others, but I would say that's probably the most significant one from my time at A2J Tech.
Right, right.
Mm.
I imagine the use case for kind of this legal education answering legal queries ultimately is a very attractive use case for Gen AI as well.
Hmm.
So has AI been involved in that at all, or how do you see it potentially getting involved in the
Yeah,
future?
so we have been. Here comes the my nuanced answer to the use of AI. I do think that AI will have a role in the legal information spectrum in a sense when providing legal information. Now, the one thing that we have noticed is that some of the generative AI tools that are out there, and even with the mainstream LLMs that are right there's still a problem with training the model to give you precise data. And what does that mean is still the AI, and probably in a few months this is going to change. But even though you might train the model with legal information, with statutes, with case law, it still gives you from time to time answer that technically speaking is not correct or is not accurate based on that fact pattern. And the other thing to consider is that there's a specific ethical line, at least for regulation of attorneys, of what means providing legal advice. So if you're an attorney, technically speaking, you cannot provide legal advice. So we always have to be very careful to the extent of which we are deploying AI. So for purposes of giving out legal information, that's certainly doable. But we have still found, again, from time to time, that it's still making up information or trying to give statements that are not entirely accurate with the legal information that has been provided to train that model. Now, that is just a matter of keeping refining and fine tuning the model itself. It doesn't mean that it's a deal breaker. Now, here comes the other problem is sometimes legal aids or even ourselves, since we have so many legal aids that we have to help, training a model is difficult to do it at a federal level because every single state has different statutes and case laws. So basically, and that's something that probably a brighter mind than mine and someone with more time can probably solve is if you can create an impactful model or impactful Gen AI model, but it has to have the ability to have those nuances of regulations on a state by state basis, and you have to productize this in a way that is appealing for legal aids, that it makes financial sense. Because again, they don't have legal aids don't have endless amount of money. They have a limited budget because they get funded to provide services. They, as many things in the world, they have to meet certain metrics and they have to report what they have done with those funds. It becomes a tricky space in a sense. But certainly for a fact, Gen AI is certainly going to impact the legal information space. I would say right now in the legal aid, we're starting to know some of the efforts, but I still think we are a few months away when we have clear Gen AI models that again do not make assumptions or do not make information. It just comes down to a better fine tuning mechanism of training that model. So yeah.
Right, right, right.
Mm.
Going back to that, precise data and hallucinations ultimately, right?
Yeah.
I understand there will also be, potentially middle ground where, if a user asks a question, the system doesn't necessarily answer it, but at least, for example, finds the articles and the data that is most relevant and presents it to the user, right? So
Yeah.
even so, it doesn't need to give up the answer, which then opens up, the wormhole of hallucinations. At least you can give an easier way for people to search for that information, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I would say probably right now we are in that stage in which we have a hybrid model that we're using AI to a limited extent, not necessarily to do a fully automated interaction with the users. But for instance, your initial interaction might be with a language model to ask some basic questions, try to route you or triage you to the right point of contact or point of service. And after that, you can escalate things. Again, I always use the chatbot model of customer support that you start interacting with a chat agent. After that, you're not able to get the information that you need. So now you have to speak with a physical agent. But again, not every legal aid has the staffing to do that. So that's why I'm
Right.
saying that some legal aids are starting to play around with it. Some others might not have the staffing right now. So with, again, the rapid evolution of how AI is gonna kick in, because I do think that if we have seen accelerated growth, is gonna just keep getting faster and better in the next few months. That's when I think we're gonna see the impact. And the other thing, to their credit, The Legal Services Corporation is the biggest funder of legal aid organizations. That means that they are the ones that give money and resources to legal aid problems to operate and provide legal help. They have been very vocal about, hey, we want to start funding projects that use Gen AI, but use it responsibly, use it ethically, and can be replicated for other legal aid. So, to their credit, they're actively promoting the use of AI as long as it's responsible and preserving the ethical standards that should be for a technology like this.
Right, right, right.
So,
Of course. No, I mean,
yeah,
obviously there are a few challenges, right? As well, it's like the
yeah,
maintenance, right? It's not only, for example, building the database for the first time; it's also keeping it
yeah.
up to date, which actually is a challenge, but also I think opens up an opportunity for anybody in the legal space, be that in legal aid or not actually legal aid. Because, for
Yeah.
example, towards the end of this week, I'll be speaking with another founder who is building a legal analysis tool for the Italian market. Right,
Mm,
you obviously have the big players, Harvey,
mm,
Casetext, whatever, right, in the US, Canada, somewhat UK, but it will definitely take some time until the technology gets to other parts of the world, be it Latin America,
yeah.
be it Europe, be it
Yeah.
other countries, and so I think there is a great potential right now, especially in the next few years, until these big players really start expanding into different regions, of building localized solutions, right,
Yeah.
for a very specific market, and again training the models to have that niche knowledge which wouldn't be available
Mm.
on a bigger scale. I understand as well for kiosks, right? Part of the reason that you're actually building those physical locations is because some of the people don't necessarily have access to internet, don't have access to a computer, right? For people that do you still see value in that project? Are you planning to make those, for example, kiosks available online as well for anybody to use?
So yeah, so the kiosk, technically speaking, the interface is available online, so people can access it at any moment in time. I think the concept of a legal kiosk itself is for that digital divide, in the sense of having an actual location or actual physical infrastructure to get that information. High speed internet with a working station that you can scan documents, print documents, or anything that you need in order to, let's say, even take notes. So that's the concept of a legal kiosk. Now, the interface that is built upon, that has the tiles and has the navigated function, that could be accessed remotely. So some programs have opened that interface up to for anyone, so it becomes like an additional self-help tool that they provide. Some others have decided, look, we already have a self-help site, so we want to keep both projects separately, no, because they don't fight with each other, but they might just create confusion. So in some programs that have more budget or more resources have decided, hey, we want to keep the interface of a kiosk with the kiosk themselves, and for everyone else, we have the self help website that is a bit more robust and a bit more broad in the type of topics that they can ask. So that is just a consideration for programs, but there's nothing that prevents the ability to have the kiosk interface on, let's say, access remotely. Mhm.
Right, and I think that's ultimately important as well, given that access online and pushing potentially as well for some of these Gen AI applications. Because what I ultimately as well see happening potentially is people, asking ChatGPT, asking Claude legal questions, and over relying on those answers given by those models, right? Where obviously again that is not really based in the specificities of each state and those regulations. So there is a potential danger for people, misusing that, right?
Yeah.
And go in the wrong direction. Now let's shift back a bit into, I guess, more traditional automation. And ultimately, AI is very cool and whatnot, but both in legal aids and with the law firms that we are working with, there is still a lot more low hanging fruits that can
Mhm.
be achieved, right, with and better ROI that can be achieved with traditional automation. So some of the biggest problems or like use cases that we are seeing at automation fullwares with our clients is things such as intake, things such as billing, things such as updating clients on their case progress. What are some of the biggest technical hurdles, challenges that legal aid organizations face that you help with?
Yeah, I would say there probably, in my experience, there are three big problems legal aids are still trying to solve, and let's say we are trying to solve as well. They're bigger problems that sometimes we expected. But number one is the ability to do better reporting. I would say probably that's pain point number one for legal aids. And when I say reporting, that does not only mean, hey, give me an Excel spreadsheet or give me a pretty bar graph or let's say pie charts about certain type of metrics, but it goes more than that. The reporting usually requires an analysis of how many cases have been opened, how many cases have been closed, how many cases had this type of, let's say, X type of demographic or Y type of demographic, how many of those cases lived in a specific zip code. So the analysis to the reporting for legal aid is more extensive than a private law firm. Again, a private law firm is going to do reporting for their senior partners or senior associates to see billing, time entries, maybe conversion rate of clients. But for legal aids, it becomes more than that. It becomes, are you using the money to, let's say, to solve the specific problems that that grant was given or awarded? To give you an example, legal aids might receive a grant to focus on evictions for X and Y type of cases. For instance, women that have been subject to domestic violence and you want to help them. So now what happens is that you have a specific grant with a specific set of funds and you have to report the impact and that you are actually using the money for that work. So it becomes more exhaustive. So reporting across the board is probably one of the more time consuming, challenging pieces of work for legal aids. I have heard stories that sometimes they spend 7, 8 hours just trying to clean up the data, try to put it in the report in the format that they need, and submit that to the funder. So that is one big problem. And again, at the end of the day, reporting is essential for them, if not necessarily the most essential, probably the one of the top priorities in their mind, because the reporting is the way in which they can keep showing that they're using the funds responsibly. Again, many of them are legal aids, so they have to be very transparent and public about how they use funds. So at the same rate, they have to be very active on that because that gives them the ability to apply for new funding. So that's one problem. The second big problem that we have been seeing, and this is not something that has just started, it has been always around, but it's a more challenging process to solve, is that usually legal aids have a referral network. That means that if a client applies for services, they might not be eligible for services. You might want to refer them to another program. Now, what happens with that is you need to send that data. But when you need to send that data, the other organization is using a system that doesn't have open infrastructure, doesn't have the ability to run APIs or webhooks. So now you're stuck on sending that information in an email or an Excel spreadsheet, and then they have to put it in to their system because it's a very, let's say, legacy system that has not necessarily been updated. So sharing data across legal aids is very difficult, not because the technology is not there yet, but because some legal aids or some community partners don't have the infrastructure to make those integrations. And at the same time, you're working with multiple technologies. There's no one solution that you can just say, okay, use this and automatically it's going to integrate you with all the case management systems out there. It still requires some custom development and some custom integrations. So that's probably that's one of the biggest challenges. And the third and probably final challenge that we have noticed is that many clients still struggle with the notion of triaging. What does that mean? Is that when a client comes in and applies for legal services, you usually have a set of priorities of what are the type of cases that you would need to assist first and what are some others that are not as pressing. For instance, someone that is subject to domestic violence is going to be on the highest of your priorities just because they are under urgent and traumatic circumstances. So you want to take care of that. On the other hand, someone might have an issue that might be a habitability issue, such as my water faucet is not working. Then again, still it's still an important issue to help them, but it's not going to be as pressing as someone that is facing physical or emotional violence. So triaging in the sense of putting the individuals into the right bucket of type of service that they need and with the right type of contact becomes more problematic because sometimes you can try to triage in the phone system in a form, but it's still not great because you're still going to have people that don't understand where to put themselves, or some individuals might have a combination of problems. They might have eviction issue on top of domestic violence, but they don't even know that they can use legal aid to also, let's say, try to solve those domestic violence issues. So it just gets more complex. But I would say those three problems have been very present and in the forefront of legal aid, and hopefully we have been solving some of those problems. We have not necessarily solved the entirety of the problem, but hopefully we'll get there in the next months. But it will require more of a team effort in a sense.
Right, right. Well, Rome wasn't built in a day, so step by
Mhm.
step, right? So to
Yeah,
summarize, it's reporting, right? Specifically because they have this funders which you need to report back to on a much more specific level than
yeah,
traditional law firms would, right? Referrals and sharing data in between these legacy systems, and
mm,
ultimately triaging and making sure they help the right person first.
yeah.
So
Hmm.
could you walk through some of the strategies and tools that you would apply in each one of these instances to help those organizations?
Yeah, so let's start with the first one, and that's the reporting. Number one, it will depend on the case management system that you use, because some case management systems already have their own reporting function, and sometimes it's just a matter of adding the right filters and the right, let's say, parameters in order to run and schedule a report, that rather than having someone manually set up that report that is going to take them 30 minutes, you can just set up an automation within the system that is going to take them 10 minutes to review, and it's scheduled to automatically generate if the case management system itself or the system that they're using allows for that. If it doesn't allow for that, now we're talking about one, using export mechanism of that data. That means using, if they have an API for exporting that data out. For instance, some systems have what is called a reports API. That means that you can push data out of the system into another system. That could be Power BI, or could be another dashboard visualization tool. That's number one. Or the second one, if they don't have a endpoint, you can just create a bot in a sense that will manually download that data and push it into a specific joint folder or joint space. If we have the ability, again, if we have the ability to do some automations, or it has a API or webhooks ability, for instance, that system, you can start thinking of using Make, Zapier, or some other integrators in a sense to run those automations based on some trigger actions. So for instance, if this happens, you want to create an automation using Make and Zapier that now pushes that information into a dashboard, but that dashboard has all of the set of conditions and filters in order to run that. So again, going back to the notion of Power BI, if you know how to use Power BI, it's a very powerful tool in a sense. So you can create some automations on grab that information, create those reports, but make sure to have the following filters and the following pieces in order to render that report in order. So that is, let's say, one of the options. If you don't have the ability to do automations, webhooks, or API integrations, going back to the Notion, you might just need to push that information manually into a joint space. And now we do talk about a semi-manual hybrid process in which now you put that data into a system that could be Tableau or another data visualization tool that already has the scripts or the specific format and the outputs that you need. So once you upload that Excel spreadsheet, it automatically cleans up the data and gives you the results. So that is, let's say, for the first problem.
So ultimately, either way, right, whether the tool allows for API access and extracting the data or not,
Mm-hmm.
you are able to provide ROI because you already kind of build out the standard reporting format, right, and that
Yeah.
cleaning and transformation of the data, right.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned tools like Make and Zapier,
Mm-hmm.
if the tool has an API. If it doesn't have an API, you also mentioned that it's possible to do it through browser automation or a bot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Could
Yeah.
you explain a bit more about those? Like, what type of tools would you use there?
Yeah, so for instance, for creating, I would defer to the more technical members of my team when they create those type of bot script solutions. But for instance, if I recall, they have used some custom Python apps that they have built in their own environments. I'm not sure that they use off the shelf solutions. Sometimes they have been mostly of, hey, we can do this scripting with using JavaScript and Python, so we can do it. Let's say the one tool that I remember that one of my members has uses Python anywhere. Again, I'm not as technical as he is, so he has used that in the past in order to render some of those automations and those bots in order to run some of those scripts for the data. But I would say usually it's a combination of doing some limited custom development on our end or using some of the shelf solutions. I would say for that specific problem, most of the time it has been of our team developing a quick JavaScript and Python script in order to create that automation
To
in the
extract the
past.
data.
Yeah.
Right, right,
Hmm.
right, right. Now, but that's ultimately what I have seen as well. It's a bit harder. I haven't found that really good of no code tools
Yeah.
for that problem of extracting the data through a browser automation, right? I
Yeah.
know that there's, I believe it's like this library called Selenium or something like that in Python.
Hmm.
Again, I haven't delved too deep into that. But what I would say as well is if somebody wants to DIY it, also having these Gen AI tools like Claude and ChatGPT actually helps you in development as well, right? And like the other day, actually, I have no idea about developing Chrome extensions, but I asked for to build out. I gave the page of Clio Manage to the HTML structure to Claude, and I asked it like, "Hey, the users have been complaining of Clio Manage that the notes are not auto saved. Develop a Chrome
Hmm.
extension that
Hmm.
would save them for them automatically."
Yeah.
And just like on the second try, it came up with working code with like 5 different files. I uploaded to Chrome and it worked perfectly fine. And after that, it was just like a
Wow.
bit of iteration
Yeah.
process. So ultimately, I
Yeah.
think that also lowers the barrier to people who want to DIY it or don't necessarily have the expertise, right, to develop those more advanced solutions. Let's go then into the second use case, or like referrals and sharing data, right? So what would you use there?
Yeah, I think that goes to a similar vein on saying, okay, we have two approaches. One, we develop integration with an automation using some, let's say, integrator platform, like a no-code integrator platform. I could make in Zapier. That's number one. The other one is usually creating API integration directly within the systems. I would say the one big problem has been, at least with legal aids, I don't think this is the same problem with law firms, just because they tend to use more modern tools that they see the value to be able to integrate with. There was always this concept that I still think it's a recipe for failure in a sense of having a closed system. That means that you cannot integrate with anything. You can only do what the platform provides, and the platform tries to be the best at everything within one single solution. I don't think that's possible. I use this analogy is when you become a lawyer, you are not good at every single legal topic. Start to specialize into something. And the same thing happens with platforms. They start to get specialized in doing specific things better. For instance, I was reading a story yesterday about Uber potentially acquiring Expedia. And in my mind, I was like, okay, Uber does one good thing, and that's the interface and the ability to ask for a drive for a specific location. Now, if you add Expedia into that, I don't know how I would feel about it. Again, that's just my personal opinion. But I'm trying to use a mainstream example to, let's say, go to my point is, if now Uber is going to be also Expedia, now it might be good at something, but now you're adding another layer of complexity, and now it might be confusing. So you're trying sometimes to do too much in a sense. So in my mind, the legal aid space or the legal space works the same in a sense that a platform is going to do some things very, very well. It's going to do billing very well, or it's going to do intaking very well. But if you try to have a closed system that you cannot integrate with, that's going to be very problematic in the long term, in the medium and long term of that sustainability of that solution. So for those specific systems that we have that are closed, that becomes very challenging. What we usually do is, again, going back to the same scripting method, is we usually set up automation that requires sending an email. From that email, queries the information, puts it on an Excel spreadsheet, and then they, let's say, manually upload that import CSV every day or every week. It depends on the system. Because they have the ability to do imports of information. The problem that many of those systems have is the ability to push information out. You can push information in, but push information out, but when you can push information in only by manual imports of CSV files, in a sense. So in those ones, again, becomes very problematic. But I would say usually in our experience, it has come down to using API integrations. And especially when doing referrals, we have worked with projects built on database structures, especially like Airtable in the past, in which Airtable serves as that database. We create the automations and the scripting within Airtable, within the automations tab of Airtable, and everything is running through Airtable. So, for instance, there's a database that is, for instance, a centralized referral. Now you have to push this information to X individual or to Y individual. We use those automations themselves. So we even bypass the need of using Zapier or Make. We can just do the direct API integration within Airtable. So that is one example, at least for the referrals case study, in a sense.
Right, right. And I mean, closed systems is a huge pain point as well for our customers. And I don't think it necessarily just depends on the range of features that the platform has to provide, because I also have seen like very specific platforms that don't have an open API, right? So it's
Yeah.
almost like just comes down, I think, like to the willingness of the vendor, right, to
Yeah.
integrate its tool with others. And again, it can be a significant pain point. I love the fact that you mentioned Airtable. I actually wanted to ask about that. I understand ultimately for really all three of these use cases, both for reporting, you know, being able to set up custom fields, being able to set up custom relations between bases that you'd be able to do in Airtable. Obviously, for referrals, sending out again those automated emails, even just within the tool without having to rely on external automation platforms. And I imagine for the triaging as well, we'll talk about that. But have you seen that it can be attractive for these organizations to move away potentially from a big case management system that has a lot of features that they don't really need, to a more custom solution, for example, an Airtable or a similar tool that just does exactly what they need?
I think there's going to be a combination of both. So, number one, I still think that there are going to be law firms or legal aids that feel comfortable with using off the shelf solutions, even if they don't use all of the features. Now, the one thing that I always tell them is be mindful of your budget. If your budget allows for that, to take more power to you and keep using the platform in a sense if that's a more strategic decision. Now, I am also of the thinking that there's now with the accelerated process of development and with some of the tools that are out there, there's going to be a trend that is going to be starting on saying, you know what, we can build something custom for a fraction of the cost that it could be maintained over time and self-managed by us. We don't have to be technical. Again, some are more technical than others. I would say that that excuse in the past of, oh, I'm a lawyer, I don't understand math, or I don't understand technology, that's just a false premise. I do think that most of the no code technologies today are very intuitive, that you can self manage and become an administrator of that technology yourself. It just requires a few iterations and learning a few things here and there. But I do see that there's a trend of custom development. Now, that will also be accelerated if there are more semi-automated ways to develop some of those custom case management systems. For instance, again, you don't, because at least for our clients, for legal aids, we don't want to build something from scratch that is completely scripted and coded. Why? Because the development time is just going to be very, very high for them. So we want to have something that makes sense with no code technologies, but at the same time, it can be scalable over time. And there's not going to be any issues with how many users you have, how many data you have. Let's say we want to build a sustainable model. For instance, we have been building solutions using Airtable, for instance, as a database, using FormStack as a document automation system, and using Stacker as a interface or a client portal functionality. So there are many good tools, and just like that, there hundreds, if not thousands, of technologies that do the same thing. Some do it better than others. But I would say I do see that there's starting to be a trend of custom development. I wouldn't say necessarily on case management systems, but certainly custom development in some other areas, like portals, client portals, or document automation solutions, and so on and so forth. So that is certainly a trend that I'm starting to notice with both legal aids and law firms that we have worked with in the
All right.
past.
Right. And I mean, like, you can also just develop a helper tool, right? That just does
Yeah.
one specific thing. You don't necessarily need to revamp all your infrastructure.
Yeah.
And that's really the beauty of this, like, custom solutions like Airtable, Zano, whatever you end up
Yeah.
using. And what I would say is as well a great trend that is helping is more of the tools start integrating AI into the development experience. So, for example, actually one feature that I have used in Airtable is when you create a new formula column, you can actually just explain in Gen AI field of like what do you
Yeah.
want to do, reference a field, and it'll actually write up the
Mhm.
formula for you. That has been extremely helpful for me because now I don't need to remember like all the obviously formals, so have to check the reference, right, the documentation
Yeah.
reference for that. Similar thing in Make and Zapier, right? They also implemented this AI solutions where you can just say like, hey, I want to connect X to Z, and I wanted to to format this data in a particular way. It will come up with a very good approximation to what you need, right? After all,
Yeah. Yeah.
lovely, lovely. Let's close up, this three use cases topic. So what about triaging?
Yeah. So triaging, it's a bit more interesting. Like that one, we don't use, let's say, any APIs or automations. Usually, with the triage, it becomes one. Let's go to the basic uses of conditional logic on some, let's say, workflow builders. Again, Gavel is one of them. FormStack is another one. There are multiple, let's say, workflow builders. Then again, workflow builders does not necessarily mean that they have to be generating a document. They can just help you to create a tree of logic in order to make certain decisions based on that. So, for instance, I know that you have experience with Gavel. With Gavel, you can create a workflow that if you select certain type of options, you might be prompted as, hey, you're not eligible for services, or if you select another set of options, it's gonna make you take some additional steps. And that when that workflow gets completed, you can ping to the system. This is domestic violence case. This is a priority X, Y, and Z. You can even send emails. You can push that into their case management system. You can create more elements complementary to that experience. But I would say for triaging, you can create that conditional logic approach, very basic. And I would say even Airtable forms have some type of conditional logic in them. We have used, say, the forms for some exercises, and you could just display a field based on certain conditions. So again, it doesn't require extensive development. Now, on the other hand, what we have also starting to experience is with some AI, and that goes to the notion of where it makes sense to deploy AI. Again, I do see that AI has in a spectrum of easy use cases for deployment to more complex. I would say on the easy side is for triaging, in which you can use AI on saying, hey, based on these conditions, right now you are eligible for services or you might not be eligible for services. So what that the AI is doing is replacing the amount of clicks that you can do in a workflow, but just asking some of the basic information up front and telling you, hey, you might not be eligible for services at that moment in time. What happens with legal aid, for instance, is that you might triage for multiple factors, but you have to also ask your financial information because you might not be eligible because you might have more than a specific income threshold, or you might have a criminal matter and you are not eligible for services because most legal aids do not provide assistance with criminal matters. That's why you have public defenders in order to help with those type of issues. So usually AI comes to give you upfront some of those excluding reasons why wouldn't be able to apply and starts to triage him on saying, okay, you are someone with domestic violence, you're eligible under the assets, you're eligible under the income, you now can apply for services. So it creates a more seamless experience for the applicant. And the one thing that I do think that AI becomes relevant is you make the user or the applicant spend less time. Right now, one of the biggest pain points, I would not say for legal aids, but for the applicants themselves, is that some of those forms for intake forms are that are trying to triage as well take a lot of time for the user to complete. So it's not something that takes 5 minutes. It's something that takes 15, 20, to some extent 30 minutes. So because it's asking you a lot of questions and the system is trying to just keep track of all the different conditions in a conditional logic tree. And in some aspects, you don't even have a conditional logic tree behind it. You just have a workflow, questions, and after the fact, the human is making the decision of are they eligible for services, yes or no. So I would say, in my experience, those have been the two approaches. One, again, conditional logic approach, very basic with existing technologies. And we have started to experiment with using AI to do some of that triaging. Then again, some of the programs that we have been working on have been very innovative and vocal about using AI for stuff like that. Because again, in those type of cases, you're not doing any legal advice, you're not making any decisions. You're just trying to help the intake staff and saying, "Hey, look, based on these conditions, this case should be a priority and should be contacted immediately," and so on and so forth. So that
Right.
is just another example.
Right, right. And I think I love that you mentioned as well Gen AI here. I mean, ultimately, I think a lot of lawyers think of AI as this one big thing that they need, this very specialized tool like Harvey
Yeah.
or whatever, right? That is going to do all of their work, right? And,
Mhm.
and replace all of their drafting, etc. But ultimately, as well, what Gen AI does, it just extends the horizon of automation that you can do, right? Where previously you had, for example, just conditional logic. Now you can go a step beyond that and actually understand language, right? Potentially understand what the user has written in a free form text and make a decision based on that.
People think that AI right now is in a place, and I blame this to some aspects to some of the mainstream news on saying, "Oh, AI is already there and fixing everyone's problems." I still think that, say, once you're on the ground looking at it in a very real and honest way, is no, it's making progress, but it's still not entirely there yet that can solve every single problem. I think it's going to be marginal improvements, and even ChatGPT is doing that. I would say ChatGPT is a good example of how every single model is a marginal improvement over the other, but you still find flaws or issues with the latest model. So, for instance, if you use ChatGPT 3.5, then you use ChatGPT 4, you started to notice some improvements. Now you start using the mini IO, you start seeing some improvements, but at the same time, you still find flaws. I think, let's say, AI is iterative and it's improving over time. So we cannot expect that just because buzz of AI is out there right now is fixing every single thing. And I would even say I listened to some because as I said, in my previous life, I used to help some startup companies and venture capitals. I listened to some podcasts that talk about venture capital trends and investment in private equity, and they even said, which I liked their perspective, and say, hey, look, AI is still in the early days. Again, that doesn't mean that you should not adopt it, but you cannot expect that it's going to be a full fledged solution right now. It's still going to require some growing pains. There are still going to be some startups that right now are valued at $100 million, but eventually will fail. That's part of this process. Is part of that destructive process of that. In that process of value creation that AI is going to create, that there's going to be some destruction with it. So it's going to destroy some startups with AI that right now seem like the best solution, and they even post, let's say, the in the forefront, we might even think of ChatGPT as the next Yahoo, in a sense that they might be very good right now, but there might be another competitor that is going to come down the road and is going to be far better, and eventually ChatGPT is going to cease to exist. We don't know, but what they put in the discussion was AI is still making strides, is still building. So we're not there yet that is going to solve every single problem. You just have to be strategic on where it makes sense to deploy it, and I think that's what we have been learning ourselves as well. That even as much as we would like to deploy AI for everything, and this goes to the lawyers sometimes that say, oh, but let's use AI for this, AI for that. And sometimes we have to even consider the ethical implications, the cost of deployment, and does it truly make sense, or you just want to add AI for the sake of AI? I have, again,
Right.
I've been in this world since 2017, and I remember that always the pitch grab was, oh, we use AI, when in reality, they were just using some basic conditional logic in the back end. So, again, I always tell people don't use the framing of AI just to sound cool, use it to truly providing value to the user experience, to you as a, let's say, for your operations, but do not just add AI to sound cool or in the forefront, because otherwise it's going to be more problematic down the road than you imagine. So, but that's again personal perspective. I know that other individuals will disagree, but that's completely fine.
I largely agree with that, and I think ultimately, just any decision in terms of tech, be that AI or not, is needs to be grounded in business logic, right? It's almost similar to, I'm part of a lot of these Facebook groups, and people are constantly asking like, oh, like, is Lomatics better than Clio? Should I switch? Should I not switch? It's like, there isn't a simple answer to that. You really need to base it on your current operations, see what are actually your pain points, see how much ROI you'd get from an automation. Because yes, you can potentially automate it with like a complex AI solution and whatnot,
Yeah.
but then, how much time are you going to spend, potentially reviewing those results, or how much time are you actually saving at all from this automation in the first place, right? So it's really just like having a cool head, and going back to the drawing board, understanding what your process is, and really breaking it down and seeing how much can you get in terms of ROI from all of these solutions, right? And only then deciding if you use AI or
Yeah,
not.
and I think you make emphasis in one thing that it's very important, and it's at the end. And again, I learned this the hard way, is that most of our technology decisions have to be user centered. And when I say user centered, is not only thinking about clients. It could also, the users themselves could be your own staff, or it could be your own, let's say, colleagues. So when you're just trying to make decisions in a vacuum without understanding interest or buy-in from, let's say, whoever the user is going to be, and you're just deploying technology for the sake of deploying technology, and the same thing goes to AI. In my experience, that's something that is going to fail quite rapidly. At the beginning, there's going to be this excitement, but if there was never this buy-in, there was never this interest, there was never this user-centered exercise for the use of any technology, and again, not only AI in general, it could be any technology, it is quite destined to fail. Again, one thing is that people are going to be vocal. The other thing is that, for instance, we have interacted with clients and say, hey, we hate that phone system. They never consulted with us. They just deployed it, and it's one of the worst things that we have in our organization. Or even sometimes they have mentioned, we have this technology that I don't know who came with the idea of it. It looks good and all, but I have never used it. So that gives you to the same notion that I do think every single technology project and every single technology implementation has to be always user centered. And again, user centered does is not a fancy word of you need to do a lot of exercises. Just be very mindful of what are the objectives, what are the interests of the users that you're developing a solution for. If you don't take that into consideration, you're gonna have more frustrations after the initial implementation of a technology, as cool as it might be. So just goes to your point, Martin, as well.
Absolutely. Well, really good points to finish and wrap up this conversation. Now, the last question that I would say is ask you is, how can people reach and follow you?
Yeah, so I'm not a big social media guy myself, but I know our company is. So you can follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. You're usually going to find us as A2J Tech, and you can go into our website as www.go2jtech.com. You can follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter, even though I'm probably more active on LinkedIn than Twitter. I do not have a TikTok. I know the company does have a TikTok. We also have a YouTube channel. We have some Udemy courses if you are interested. You can search for A2J Tech, and some of our document automation and legal technology courses will show up. We're currently working on a few other courses that we expect to have in Udemy in the next couple of months. Yeah, that's how you can contact me or contact A2J Tech.
Amazing, amazing. I love that also you are both, providing solutions for like the DIY sector, and people that just want to learn this tools themselves, right? And then also
Mhm.
obviously, custom solutions. Fantastic. Thank you very much for this conversation and your time, Mauricio. It was amazing to be talking about automation and AI and access to justice. If like we're posting podcasts like this, videos about automation on our YouTube channel as well. And you can reach me at LinkedIn, at Martin Kravchenko, or automationfollowers.com to check our work at Automation Followers. Thank you very much again, Mauricio. It was a pleasure, and have a fantastic day.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Martin. We'll see you next time.